Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2016 Hinton Lecture, the flagship lecture of the Academy. This lecture honours the late Lord Hinton of Bankside, the first president of the Academy. Lord Hinton was one of the 20th century's most eminent engineers, making an enormous contribution both to the technology of energy generation and in later life to politics as an active member of the House of Lords. The annual Hinton Lecture addresses some of the greatest engineering challenges faced by the profession. And tonight, our topic is data, the enabler that has the potential to transform our society and our economy like nothing else before it. To look into the future of data, I am delighted to introduce Sir Nigel Shadbolt, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Oxford and Principal of Jesus College, Oxford. He is also the Chairman and co-founder with Sir Tim Berners-Lee of the Open Data Institute. Sir Nigel has been acknowledged over many years as a global pioneer in providing readily accessible and well-managed data that can benefit society. He has also warned of the importance of protecting our data properly, both public and private data sets. Sir Nigel is a fellow of this Academy and is currently principal investigator of a 1.64 million EPSRC-funded programme grant researching the theory of problem-solving systems involving large numbers of humans and computers. In 2006, he was one of the 3 founding directors of Garlic Limited, which in 2008 was awarded Technology Pioneer status by the Davos World Economic Forum and won the prestigious UK National BT Flagship Award. In 2009, Sir Nigel was appointed Information Advisor to the UK government, helping to transform public access to government information. He was awarded a knighthood in 2013 for services to science and engineering. I'd now like to invite Nigel to give his lecture, Engineering the Future of Data, and after the lecture, he's agreed to take questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Nigel.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here and giving this lecture this evening. The tweet handle there, at Nigel_Shadbolt, is how you can follow me if you're into Twittering. And there are 3 institutions I want to acknowledge my thanks to. The University of Oxford Department of Computer Science, where my research group is now, Jesus College, which provides a wonderful collegiate atmosphere in which to kind of carry on thinking about problems great and small. And the Open Data Institute, which is very close to both mine and Tim's heart, where we try and make the case for data, and in particular, open data. Now, I have a good number of slides. I always do. They're mainly images because I think they can kind of invoke more in the mind. So this isn't well, actually not all. There's quite a few data segments, but bear with me. This is a slide really that makes a point about moves that have transformed human civilization, and they're all demonstrating when what was formerly scarce becomes abundant. So the agrarian revolution, the very first taming of domestic livestock, large-scale arable farming, changed the world. The invention of movable type changed the world. Books became available at a scale that had never been seen before. And as these wonderful slides from the opening of the Olympics show, we've seen that happen again with the Industrial Revolution. Manufactured goods became available at a scale that hadn't been seen before. Really, some of the great engineers in human history conducting that work here in Britain. And then, of course, our most recent transformation, disruption in some sense, the web, internet, digital availability, and the wonderful tweet that Tim made at the opening of the Olympics, this is for everyone. There's something very emblematic and important about that value statement. It's what many of us believe. Now, I do start many of these presentations with actually a serious recognition of our debt that we must pay to our engineers of another sort, electrical engineers, in fact. So this is a presentation, many people will, you see this in many guises, this is Moore's Law, and I think I wanted to kind of bring it to life in terms of my own experience. When I went to university a very long time ago, back in the day, Motorola had just launched its Motorola 6800, a chip that at the time had 4,100 transistors, and it was smoking stuff. It allowed us to do basic tasks, but just 5 years later, a next series, next generation, had more than 10 times as many transistors. The ability of electrical engineers and large-scale engineering effort to deliver doubling computing power on about a 2-year or less basis has changed the world. It's changed the world in ways that we're still struggling to kind of understand. And I often say that, you know, the cathedrals of the 21st century and 20th century are the extraordinary die-cast, the engineering that has gone into producing constructs that are now so ubiquitous but so extraordinarily complex that it's easy to ignore them. This is the Intel Coppermine chip. This is a chip that had 21 million transistors in 2000 as I moved down to Southampton, and was allowing us to do new kinds of calculation and computation on really available commoditized hardware, network analysis, graph-based analysis. The stuff of modern data analytics is born of the fact we have a lot of processing power. I'm looking forward to taking delivery of my latest MacBook Pro, which will be boasting nearly 2 billion processors, and many people in this room will be sporting, well, a smartphone. But the Apple iPhone 6, for example, has a chip that's supporting 3 billion transistors. That gives rise to computing at a level that changes everything in terms of what can be processed, what can be held, not just in the cloud, but locally. Important point to make, that in 1980, the IBM cabinets there, 8 cabinets holding about 25 gigabytes of memory and costing just over $1 million. And in about 2008-ish, you'd be able to buy thumb drives, literally tiny miniaturized memory devices with 10 times that data capacity for about $100. Kreider's law, the ability to exponentially again, increasing ability to store more and more information at smaller and smaller scales for less and less money. And this has given us, if you like, the fundamental tools to do a lot of the kind of software engineering, the data analysis that we talk about. So we all are aware of the data deluge. It is just one visualization from the amount of data that autonomous cars might generate per second, around about 1 gigabyte, going up all the time, to there on the far right, the square kilometre array, a piece of astronomical kit that will be delivering 350 exabytes a year. It's a world in which the zeros rapidly outrun our ability to give them names, and we're at the kind of, we started in the gigabyte, which seemed a lot when I was a lad, to the terabyte, to the petabyte, to the exabyte, the zettabyte, the yottabyte, and the brontobyte beckon. Not yet standardized quite, but as a nomenclature, but they beckon. So, a little diversion this, and this is not meant in a little epistemological diversion. When we talk about the data revolution, people can get quite exercised by this, and as somebody likes to be straight about these kind of philosophical kind of distinctions, let's just reflect on the fact that data, when we talk about open data, we're not talking about open data. We're usually talking about open information. Why? Well, because those symbols on the screen there don't mean anything at all until I give you a context. And the context here is, well, that could be temperature and centigrade, and that actually a white blood cell count. Okay, that's putting a meaning to the data, and almost everything we're doing in the open data world is all about delivering up information that has a semantic scheme or meaning, not always provided in a very accurate way, I should say, which is one of the challenges we have. And then we move up the kind of value chain, of course, to knowledge. What might you do when you saw that temperature and that white blood cell count? Well, you might suspect that the individual had a bacteriological infection, and you might think about prescribing antibiotics. So actionable information, one way of thinking about knowledge, if you will. This value chain, people say, of course, there's wisdom up there at the top, which we all recognize, elusive in many cases. But the fact is that when we're looking at the use of data, we're trying to think about how ultimately it can be made actionable, used. The other thing we spend quite a lot of time in the ODI trying to clarify is this whole notion of types of data. And we've come up with this concept of the data spectrum, which ranges from open on the right-hand side there through to closed. And we recognize that data has many different varieties and subspecies. And it's hugely important when you're talking about data to be clear about whether we mean open. And very often, relatively uncontested data like where the bus stops are, what the train fares are, count as fully open. They're available with an open license that allows people to do what they will with it. The kind of journey we've come on that I'll talk about shortly. But we also recognize that in certain cases the data is best thought of as shared. It's shared between the individual consumer or citizen and the state or business. Medical research data, you can allow access via authentication. There's a spectrum through to stuff that we regard very much as closed. And that might be personal data, it might be government national security data. Actually, when we work on domains like this in the Open Data Institute, we actually try and frame all of our work and policy across the entire spectrum. We think there's a particularly valued part of the spectrum which should be as wide as possible, which is open data, and I'll try and make that case now. But it's really important that when you deal with organizations and governments, you can explain how a data strategy can apply across this whole range of data types. Now, here's a great example of data that relates to a natural structure that has been seen to have huge public good. This is the human genome. That's a visualization of one of the ways of visualizing information about the human gene. You may remember that when this was announced, when the fully sequenced genome was announced in this wonderful dual publication in Science and Nature, there's a very youthful and happy-looking Tony Blair on the right. They made that announcement, and what was quite significant about it, it reversed a decision that had seemed to be made, that the genome, that data relating to the human genome was patentable. In fact, businesses had been constructed on the assumption, and the NASDAQ was trading in their shares, that parts of this sequence would be, in a certain sense, ownable. That was struck down by a US Supreme Court judgment. It took a few $1 billion, actually, out of NASDAQ. The claim was that made openly available for everyone to exploit, there would be more widespread utility. And there certainly was. People argue about just how big it is, but there's no doubt that unlocking that data so as not to attract particular monopolistic exploitation has been universally acknowledged to be hugely powerful. It's happened with the GPS signal, which originally, of course, was militarily encrypted. The value that accurate global positioning and time data provides everyone is now uncontested. And essentially, what we've been doing in this open data journey, and here's an early photograph of sadly more youthful pair of us down there. This is the Guardian headquarters, where we had an event in about 2009 where we were going around. We had this wonderful mandate from the then PM, from Gordon Brown, to try and make public data available. And so we got this great, that's a very youthful Mike Bracken in the back there. Okay, for those who know Mike, this is a group of people who were doing good things at the Guardian and trying to promote the idea of make our data free. The taxpayer would pay for some of this stuff. Why wasn't it available? Well, you might think, cast your mind back to 2009, wasn't it? Well, here's the truth of it. This was the thing we produced, and we produced it literally as a paper in The Guardian. We called it the postcode paper. And there is a postcode, and within the paper we ran off all sorts of public statistics data that government collected. Everything from green spaces to the crime rates, reported crime rates, to where the schools were, to what the spending on hospitals and schools were. All sorts of information, down to bus stop timetables. And we actually showed that to government ministers. We took it into a cabinet meeting, in fact, and people admired it, and they liked it particularly because it wasn't some fangled web technology. It was a paper. You could open it up and they said, well, this is the job done then. And we said, actually, they're a bit perplexed that the inventor of the web had given them a newspaper. And then we said, well, actually, the sad truth is that almost all the information we reproduced, down to the postcodes, was Crown copyright, and you had to pay to get it, or you couldn't get it openly. Right? That very fact led us on a journey. And it began with the liberation of data sets in particular areas where we could get sponsors in departments. We started off with data.gov.uk in 2010 when it was launched in January with, well, this is a bit later than that, 4,600 data sets from across government departments, fully open under a new kind of license, the Open Government License, which allowed you to use it for commercial and non-commercial purposes, only save that you should acknowledge where you got it from. The current version of data.gov sports 40,000 data sets. Okay, that sounds like a good number. We'll come back to whether it's as good as it should be. But it's a very expanded set of now centrally findable public data. And I want to look about what that has done and what it means and what we mean by engineering this data in a way that's fit for use. So, some examples of data that was released. Famously, what we did was release information on government spending. So this was every local government authority spending over a particular amount had to be published as open data. All contracts placed had to be available openly and searchably. And this has now happened. We famously got the various constabularies around the UK to publish their reported crime data. Famously, police.co.uk launched, and the one thing they weren't expecting was for the whole country to turn up and use it. It broke and crashed. It went down in flames on the first day as they realised they had to do a bit more stress testing and get it up there. But now, routinely, and this is data from just where we are, it's detailed statistics for the Strand and Whitehall, comparison of crime types between 2015 and 2016. There you are, lots of antisocial behaviour, other theft, lots of violence, and well, actually, we don't want to look too closely on that, but you'll be glad to know that we're in the sanctity of Carlton Terrace Gardens here. There's very little piece of antisocial behaviour, but generally, this placing of reported crime on a monthly basis has provided a whole set of services and insights that insurance companies, police themselves now use. Interestingly, the apps that people have built around this are widely used by the police themselves rather than them kind of using their own systems. This is health, where we have everything from obesity rates in young children through to mortality rates in our hospitals. Controversial stuff. You will recall all of the furore around the fact that people were reporting that we were more likely to die if you were admitted in the weekend in A&E hospitals around NHS England than other times. And you might argue about, well, just how good is this data? It gets a conversation going that holds various service delivery accountable. There are issues we'll come back to around the provenance and quality of all of this information. My favourite one in health is work that Ben Goldacre has been doing to exploit the fact that every GP in England has to produce every month all the prescriptions they write, not to who, you'll be glad to know, but what the drug was and how much. And that allows analysis at a very fine-grained level of all sorts of prescribing behaviours. So here's an example where one particular part of the health system, one particular region is being looked at as to how it's prescribing. This is current data, statins. Statins are available in cheap generic versions or more expensive proprietary formats. There's a national median on that about how much is prescribed, the percentage of types of drug. This authority could have saved £133,000 over 6 months had it prescribed that type of drug close to the national mean. Okay, you can argue about how you rank this, how you call these facts out. There are millions and millions of pounds to be saved in the prescribing behaviour available in this data. DEFRA has recently become the latest ministry to seriously embrace open data. We had somebody from the Open Data Institute working with the then Secretary of State, Lynn Truss, in her office to get this data opened up. And we all know flooding data, a pretty interesting area for people as they get into the whole issue around climate change and extreme weather events. And this is actually taken from a river quite close to our home in Lymington, where the river rates are now being broadcast in real time, freely available, lots and lots of widgets and apps that use this data to give people warning around floods. And all of this work has put the UK in a good position. In various indexes, we come out number one, or have been doing for the last number of years. It's continued vigilance to stay doing the right thing in this domain, and I will talk about that a little more now. Open Data Institute then. So here we were set up as a not-for-profit, not a part of government, but supported by government, but also getting funding from the commercial and various other international governments to explain the benefits and help promote open data in the economy. One thing we've done is incubate a whole range of companies that are looking to build businesses around open data. And I'm going to talk about 2 examples tonight, companies that we mentored through the process of expanding their businesses that we're particularly proud of. And it's going to start with Transport API. This is a company that aggregates data. It's a company that takes a whole range of existing data sets that are published now openly and provides a set of services to help you build the apps and services you need. So they're not building the services themselves, they're providing access to clean, high-integrity data. And the thing you get nowadays, you used to get to turn up to the website and download a bulk data set, a big spreadsheet of data. But very much, a lot of the best quality data is served through application programming interfaces, or APIs. Simple calls to particular data that is held by the organization to answer questions. And in this case, their transport API allows you to get particular real-time information. So as we drill down in here, now this is how thrilling it can get in the world of data. This is bus stops. There are 360,000 bus stops in the United Kingdom. When the data was published openly for the first time from NAPTAN, the government discovered to its chagrin that 16,000 of them weren't where they thought they were. Okay, the great mystery of the missing bus stops. In fact, data's like that. You know, it's never quite as accurate as you thought. Stuff moves and changes, and that level of error rate was actually fairly reasonable, it turns out. By releasing it, the data was improved very, very quickly. Better data came in. There is a general problem about how the government takes the crowd insight and improves its data. That is work that's ongoing. But here we've got Transport's API. There's a particular request you can make which gives you, well, first thing you have to start with is the identifiers for all of those bus stops. They all have a unique identifier, it turns out. Good thing identifiers, they refer to a thing in a stable and authoritative way. ATCO codes give us access to the 360,000 bus stops. And wouldn't it be great if lots of our national estate had that kind of notion of persistent identifier? Moreover, that if you were to click on it in a web browser, you get to underlying characteristics about that data. That simple, fundamental insight will drive the future of much of our well-engineered data. So here we are, and this is even more thrilling. I've just put in a particular bus stop code, and I've got the details now of, in this case, an actual bus service running through and its complete kind of journey through time at a particular time that query was made. There's some weird things though in the world of travel data. You think this fundamental infrastructure will just be everywhere and available for everyone. Well, I'll talk about that in a moment. But actually, this is a wonderful website that keeps lists of the various ways things are referred to that have come down through deep historic time. This is a wonderful outfit. Railway Codes, a .org, who spend their time collecting all the various strange nomenclature for identifying everything from train stations to bridges. Okay, some of this dating back to the 19th century that provides the unique reference points that many services use to work out the distance between two places. We do live in an age of GPS, but many of the core reference standards still make use of these very, very important descriptors. Any infrastructure needs to know where they are and take care of them. This is a group of volunteers who do this. Okay. Now, Transport API are we're very proud of as one of our startups. It actually is able to do what it's able to do because there is high quality data being provided to it. Where? Well, in this case, much of its data comes from Transport for London, TfL. TfL had a Damascene moment where they decided to make their data, all of it, freely available. They used to charge for it. In fact, they used to have a group of people they would pay to write applications to do things like get you around the city, okay, optimize your travel time. Well, they made it freely available, and then suddenly they have their own API now, and you can get, calls to this API will give you the data you need. Here's a fantastic set of data that's telling you about various forms of status on tube lines. What's this? We all now use apps all the time that give us that information. Not very long ago, this was the world we lived in, where train operators would charge you for the timetable data and charge application developers for information about fares. This is a very different world now. And I don't know about you, but one of the apps I use routinely, there's no particular plug here, City Mapper, gets me around London in a way that is a seamless experience. A huge user of TfL data. This is another player in the space. So they're not an aggregator. They will build you, they provide you apps for your mobile phone. City Mapper coming to a city near you now. But the thing is that they're integrating across the whole transport network. It can only work where you have authoritative data being provided at source to well-engineered levels by the state or by organizations, governmental organizations, organizations that are commissioned to do that. And this is really the kind of the issue we really want to get onto here is the nature of infrastructure. It has to be reliable, safe, of high quality. We understand this when we think of railways and power grids. Why don't we ask those same questions of the data infrastructure which runs so much of our lives? I've given you a good use case here in transport where we're moving to a better place. Still ongoing work, still large amounts of data up and down the country that need integrating, but we're on the case. Needs good governance, needs to be interoperable, and there are economic considerations with effective infrastructure, and often we need appropriate choice. Give you another example, another of our startups, open corporates. I say our startups. These companies actually both existed at the point the ODI was founded, but we took, if you like, them in and helped mentor them and develop these businesses, and they're now kind of some of the alumni, which we're very proud. This is Open Corporates, a company that collects data about legal companies, corporate data. And when Chris Taggart was beginning this work, he was very proud to have information on nearly 4 million companies. Just 2010, company now has access to 110 million companies. He's doing this job for companies around the world. Many jurisdictions don't maintain definitive lists of their legally registered companies. But much more than that, not just knowing what the companies are, where they're registered, who the directors are, interesting questions like beneficial ownership. Do you remember that? This issue, who has shares in who exactly? And is it in people's interest to know that? And here's the kind of latest information you can get. Diageo PLC, we know where they are, we know there is a unique number for them. All this information can now be found from the web, not just from open corporates, but from companies' houses itself, as we'll see. Beneficial ownership tree, there are the kind of companies in which Diageo has an explicit major shareholding. That information is becoming available. This is good. This is good because we can now build APIs to access that data and provide it for other people to build their applications. It's also good because it casts a bit of a light on the world of how companies work and interrelate. And I'm just going to show you here an example. This is, now hopefully the technology will hold up here. Always dangerous, I know. Right, here is, should always say that you should never do this, should you? It's like having performing animals on stage. There we are. BP, that is this map here. This is live data from open corporates, and we can see here, as I move across them, we're seeing not just the companies, but what the beneficial ownership relationships are. So what companies in the BP family are owned by other companies, and how those chains of ownership unfold. And there are interesting things. You can see BP has interests, as you might expect, where its major registered companies of interest are. Those maps look very different as you move from company to company. Let me move to Goldman Sachs. That's always interesting. There we are. This large landmass here, that's the Cayman Islands, by the way. Okay, I will move on. Okay. A lot of what's available there is only available because, and it's available a lot more easily because Companies House itself has changed its entire philosophy as to how it publishes and how it makes available this fundamental data. Free to use with its own API. API again. There is the set of fundamental calls you can make to the underlying data in a well-engineered format to do everything from search for officers or the company, or indeed disqualified officers. You can begin to get an idea of the opportunities that will surround you as you get to be able to do this. They've also invested a lot of time in something very geeky that we as engineers should applaud, standards to represent information about the objects of interest. So-called URIs. URIs are Uniform Resource Identifiers. They're ways of referring to things stably on the web, giving a web dereferenceable address, and that gives us lots and lots of benefits, as we shall see. Okay, what we're after here is the notion of an open data infrastructure, and I've given you some examples here, by no means exhaustive, I should say, but from contracts to energy consumption to timetables and administrative geography, there is much to go at here. One of the things that Tim and I were always very concerned to try and achieve was to build the notion of linked data. Now, linked data, all you need to know of linked data really is that the UK is already doing it, and some of it's to a very high standard. It's the ability to use that idea of a URI and use it everywhere in your government data sets and possibly applications, because it's going to become a fundamental connection point to lots of other information. And one such set of information is the Ordnance Survey data, a range of products now available as open data, and this is actually postcode data. And there's much data in here about the administrative geography of the United Kingdom. And what that allows us to do is interconnect. So whenever anybody is building an application that references other government data, they should be using these identifiers, because then you can link from one place to another. Lots of data now available openly, some of it linking to other resources on the web of data, like DPpedia or GeoNames. These are both big databases that are now emerging in this cloud of connected, freely available information. And that provides all sorts of new opportunities. We're seeing it with the Land Registry, historic price paid data for housing in the United Kingdom. Same approach, driving all sorts of commercial activities, from money saving expert through to applications that allow you to kind of scope out and look for new opportunities to locate anything through retail outlets to emergency health access points. What we're after in all of this is reliable, repeatable, efficient, scalable, transparent data. Data that can be repurposed, that has information about the data itself or metadata, and that somebody has given thought to designing rather than simply taking what's there and getting on with it. Those examples I've given you are great examples of bits of the government estate that has got the idea, engineered to a high standard, provided access through an API, thought about using the web, and made it freely available. They're not the only people who do this. I mean, we can look at Google search term here. The information you're now seeing in the linked data world, interesting example of this, Google are great users of other people's open data. We should think about making Google a little bit more sensitive to the fact that it should be pushing its data out as openly reusable on a more routine basis, because I think that just creates more value for everybody. There are challenges in all of this, and I want to talk about those before we get to questions. One is that the challenges to this vision of widely available, highly and well-engineered data is what's now called the walled garden problem. The fact that our big internet platforms want to keep you within their embrace. They'll give you a perfect experience. If you give them your data, they will give you great services back, and they'd rather you didn't stray to other parts of the web or internet. And it's really important that when we build our data assets, we don't end up with them locked behind a walled garden because they're using a proprietary data standard, or there's some other impediment to getting the information connected. All of this work requires thought about how to simplify your data representations. All of this work has challenges that relate to things like, well, this is a wonderful slide, the tortured geography of England. The problem with data is that people who collect it often release it according to particular administrative geographies. So the Met Office regions here, there are 6. Local government associations, 7. HMRC valuation office agencies, 7, but not the same. 10 European regional development funds, but at the moment, NHS strategic health authorities, not the same. None of these are exactly the same geography. They all divide things up differently, and it's a complete nightmare when you come to try and integrate data sets, which means that it's even more important to use and reuse those broad generic ways of identifying place and space. Those Ordnance Survey, URIs, for example. Don't collect your data according to some arcane geography. Use a core reference identifier. Another big thing we should be aware of, I submit, is the challenge of security. Now, this is just one visualization of a denial of service attack. This is huge amounts of requests coming into, in this case, a website, that just stuffs everything up. If you think about your national infrastructure as a set of APIs, as a set of access points to key information, you'll need to keep it safe. You'll need to think about how you stop it being subverted or changed. This stuff is underway all the time. This is the famous attack on the 25th of December last year. It's kind of clear where it might be originating from, and it's pretty clear where it's landing up. This kind of spoiled a lot of Americans' Christmas Day when large amounts of traffic suddenly descended on some of their servers and they couldn't play their favorite games or access their favorite websites. This whole issue of defense of your infrastructure will be important, as will making it available. A couple of final points. This is another adverse side, I think, to where people should think about the challenge around data. People often said, you open this data up, you make yourself vulnerable. Actually, open data is very resilient. Lots of eyeballs on the data often improve it. And the other thing to say about that is that code is data. Okay, if you think about the algorithms that are running over the code, they're just another kind of data. In fact, in a very pure sense, AI has always understood this with languages like Lisp. Data and programs are the same thing. We're now required to think about how we have our algorithms be scrutable and accountable. And a good way of doing that is to make them available for inspection, to have standard ways to interrogate them. A fundamental challenge we have, I would submit, and this is a slide from 2010, still one of the best examples I have, is data literacy. This was a great story that was being run. I'm sure it didn't lead to Brexit itself, but actually this was a calculation that appeared in a daily newspaper claiming that we're the most overpopulated country in the EU. Well, it was if you took a particular official statistic and forgot to recognise that the statistics taken from, say, Holland hadn't factored out all that part of Holland that's underwater. Okay, so there's ways in which your devisers and your fundamental interpretation of statistics requires a degree of critical thinking. And this is a fairly important guy in all of this now. It's if we're going to invest in our infrastructure at scale, physically, should we be thinking about investing in our data infrastructure? I've given you the good news of examples where it's working very well. There are lots of ministries and lots of assets that are not made available to this same high quality, that are required to comprise our national data infrastructure, and also an international effort. We understand that you have to invest in the railways and the national grid and other sorts of critical infrastructure. It's not just about broadband, it's about the stuff that flows over those pipes. Thank you very much.
Nigel, thank you. Thank you very much for a absolutely fascinating lecture, spreading right across the whole of the data space, and I'm sure it's generated lots of questions. So I throw the questioning open to our audience. If you've got a question to ask Nigel, could you put your hand up and then wait until the microphone gets to you and start by saying your name and affiliation. Questions, please? Yeah, one here.
Thank you very much for the lecture. David Lyford-Smith from the Institute of Chartered Accountants. You were speaking something on the subject of unique identifiers. I think the kind of elephant there is a unique identifiers for people. We don't have any kind of common system in government for recognising people, and obviously it's a very politically charged and philosophically charged topic. So I just wanted to know what your position was on that.
Sorry, just can you say that? It was about them being...
unique identifiers for people. We don't have any kind of single identity, way of identifying humans, citizens.
People don't. Sorry,
people. Sorry, the microphone's a little difficult.
Yes,
sorry.
Charged topic that, yes. Should people have a URI? I mean, it seems to me, in some sense, that we'll give everything an identifier, from lampposts to bus stops to surgical procedures. And in many contexts of public life, similarly identifiers exist. So all of the civil service, the various roles and functions. But our own personal identity is something that in the UK in particular, we're very kind of leery about. Interesting, kind of resistant to this idea, and yet we have national insurance number, we have various forms of identification that we do use to government. In fact, government finds this so challenging that its own identification verify method is trying to have a triangulation that outsources some of this problem to third parties. I think in a way it is a piece of cultural heritage and baggage that why wouldn't we want to get beyond it in some sense? The worry is, of course, does it make certain sorts of surveillance and targeting easier? We carry all sorts of great surveillance and targeting technology around with us all the time. And I do think that we have to think about the pros and cons of this. It's not a settled item at all. Of course, within government, the need to be able to determine that an individual who they say they are is well understood. I think we understand that as well as a society. It would be nice to have an intelligent debate about how we provide the benefits of clear
naming and identification, whilst respecting people's control over their own information and their own privacy in this context. That's the other side of the coin we haven't talked about much this evening.
Okay, thank you. Question right at the back.
Thank you. Peter Blair, this is a comment more than a question. Looking at your England's tortured geography, I was immediately reminded of the diagram that our president produced in the review of research organisations across the UK. I think maybe you saw that as well.
Well, I tell you, devolution, although admirable in some respects, is a nightmare for data as well. I mean, the whole distribution and disaggregation can be a challenge, and these different authorities. It's why I think some thought about whether there are other ways of referencing objects that don't lock you into a particular moment in administrative history. It's why, for example, RURI should never refer to a government department. That'd be fatal, you know. I mean, it needs to refer to something about the underlying piece of the infrastructure fabric. So yes, I absolutely recognise that challenge.
If I could just add, I mean, do you see this ever getting sorted? And are we putting money into trying to sort it?
Well, two things. Yes, we should do more to try and harmonise. Famously, we're trying to sort out the number of lists of foreign countries that the government operates with. I think there were 32 or something going around at one stage. There are reasons, though, why you will want multiple lists, you know, historical reasons. It's not as if things stay the same forever, and it's not as if we always insist that there should be one canonical way of labelling everything. And in fact, what the Reb recognises is you might have multiple schemes, but you'll have to know where equivalences exist. But the issue about just being muddled about what it is to identify objects at all, yeah, we should sort this out. And where we actually need persistent, stable identifiers for our data infrastructure in the country, yes, surely. We recognise it on a case-by-case basis, but we don't engineer for it collectively.
And is any sorting out being done internationally? You talked a lot about UK government. Is there an international link?
There are areas. I mean, there's the Open Government Partnership, which is looking at some of these challenges. There are sectors, of course, who have understood this for some time. And so, you know, in geospatial, there's the INSPIRE directives. The trouble with some of these international efforts is they end up with a standards book this thick, and you lose the will to live. We're talking here, in one sense, about standards, and the web standards are a great example. They're complex, but they're just complex. They're just complex enough. They're not really complex. They're very well, elegantly engineered to be just enough standardization to unify. And there are only relatively small numbers of these you need to agree on to be able to allow a much wider scale integration and not get bogged down into very, very large standard setting issues. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Further questions? Yes.
Vicky Morgan from the UK Collaborative on Development Sciences. You mentioned the success stories of the government ministerial data, but there's a way to go. What would be top of your wish list?
Of my wish list?
Yes, for data sets you'd like to see in the public.
Well, due to my private grief. There should be a publicly open available address file. The legal addresses of this country should not be in private ownership. They should be available openly for use, because they have huge utility in provision of services, not just government services, but every kind of commercial service. There are other areas where we should be looking. The descriptions of clinical procedures, but more to the point, what individual hospitals offer in terms of those procedures. That's known information. It's just often locked up in PDF documents if it's somewhere on a website. So there are lots of areas where the information is actually there, but it's not there in a machine-readable way that's accessible. So I think you could go through most Department of States and find examples where we need to work much harder. In fact, we worked at the ODI on a list of our essential information infrastructure that's missing. There is government commitment to getting on and doing this, but actually you really need resource to get behind it and do it. And you just don't need government doing it. You need a kind of a coalition of the willing in this space.
Thank you. Yeah.
Peter Payne. You talked about scrutiny of algorithms, and it seems a bit pertinent at the moment with regards to things that happen in the US elections and the like. Do you think that we're at a tipping point where news providers, social media providers need to be more open about their algorithms and how they open up that, so that we don't end up with people getting polarised information based on their likes and previous likes. A sort of a social context to the algorithm.
I think the whole notion of fake news, the whole notion of echo chambers in social media, the whole notion of scrutability of the algorithms that run the recommendation engines and the selection and filtering is huge in the intro of many of these companies now. In fact, some of their founders have been talking about it. You know, it may seem a bit after the fact, but no, I think this will be a very real conversation. And I know news agencies themselves are working out how do we begin to promote the real from the fake, you know, the mythical from the urban myth from the fact. And this is important, I think. The notion of authoritative news, the notion of when it's worth presenting, what does a balanced case mean here? If there's just wildly inaccurate or unsupported information being promoted, what is the duty of care on public bodies to sort of say, well, actually, you know, some facts are sacred, okay? And we can argue about this contextualization and presentation. Let's argue about them in a way that's much more informed than simply now almost this willful generation of misinformation. And if it's going to happen, then we need to understand how we can build protective measures against that and understand how to filter the space more effectively. Education has to be the key here, by the way, of data literacy, and allowing our students and people in our schools to understand what a critical approach to the information they're being offered actually means.
At the back there, and then we'll come here.
This is John Tayson from the Web Science Trust. Sir Nigel, that was tremendous, as always. Some wonderful engineering descriptions, but I'm wondering about the economics, and it really follows from that previous question. We know, I think, don't we now, that the web, though the intention was to empower us and give us all a voice, actually concentrates power to our horror, both economically, because winner takes all, and politically, as we've seen in the last two election and referendum. Isn't there a worry that we should have that making the data open empowers a winner-takes-all, single winner?
Yes, this is often a worry that's expressed. You know, just making this data open means that the big incumbents just get more incumbent. I think we can't. If it's going to be open, it's going to be open, and we've got to think about other ways of dealing with these challenges around incumbency, which are very considerable. And we will be in a position where we'll have to ask ourselves questions around what the barrier to entry to really true innovation now is. And in the past, when we've had sectors and industries in that position, people have taken actual affirmative action on this. And you know, we can argue about what the political conditions were required to break up, you know, the US telephone monopolies once upon a time. We can argue about how this should work, but the notion of equitable competition and whether if you have all the information or are not putting back, there's an issue here around good behavior. When data is being sucked in from the public domain, good high quality data, and being improved, is there not some kind of duty of care to put it back, to have some kind of levels of understanding? People say, well, this is just hopelessly aspirational. But we do understand in many other areas the notion of corporate responsibility in emissions, in all sorts of ethical trading. I think there are data deals to be done here about the duty of care that the very big organizations have over the information that they're garnering, and they use and exploit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you talk about the walled garden that is Google and the particular instances of data that you would recommend that they could do a better job at opening up? Because I know that if they were aware of this, that they would be inclined to help.
Oh, I think so. I mean,
my name's Alexander Truby, and I work for Google.
I don't want to call out a particular organization in this context. I mean, they just happen to have some of the most fabulous applications and data sets and people working for them. But I think that's even more incumbent then to sort of think about this issue seriously. So, and sometimes it's unintended consequences. So the fact that claims are made over derived data. The fact that you put your walking routes onto a Google map gives them a right to kind of use that necessarily or lay claim to it. There are issues here that just need a different kind of settlement. The issue about using some of their data more openly for research purposes, to help improve, for example, the data held in collective commons like Wikipedia. They actually import a large amount of information of that sort and enhance it and improve it. What's that relationship back? So I think we can look at examples like that where particular data holdings that they have access to would improve the collective experience that we all have and help governments. So they have very comprehensive and curated and well-managed transport information. That's not their main business. That's not what they're kind of making, in some sense, their profits on. So I think there would be conversations to have here about where, in infrastructural terms, their curation and management is providing a good product that could actually be even more useful emitted back as openly usable data so that other people can innovate around it. That's not a shout out on Google. I say this applies to many organizations who are big incumbents in this space. Yeah. Yeah.
I do have another question there, if I can.
Do you want to respond?
I don't want to do a supplementary on that, no.
You're thinking about internally.
Well, absolutely. I mean, as you know full well, Google are very collaborative in this space. We would like to do what we can to help, and it's a matter of resources, not will, in this particular respect. I have a question about care.data. There was a will there to open data. Why did it not work? So it's not just about having a will. There's obviously a means or a process that needs to be followed in terms of opening up data.
Well, care.data, this refers to the medical record data. And I think in this whole area, the notion that we have to think about how we present this to the public. And I think there is an issue about what people understand the symmetry to be between organizations that manage this data and themselves as either citizens or consumers. And I think that trust issue, we have to think about the kind of balance here rather differently. So how can we convince people that the data will empower them, that they have some rights and entitlements over that their information that is demonstrated to be taken seriously, rather than the thought that, oh, I'm going to end up consented into this system to use my medical records and I don't have control. It's easy to get people to a position where they're very suspicious about that. So I think, again, it requires serious conversations. There are experiments, of course, just announced this week in the use of medical data in a really interesting experiment, I think, on this. And people are rightly asking questions, well, how will this data be used? Well, it's anonymized, it's purpose limited. It's a very interesting example of applying the latest kind of machine learning methods to trying to refine clinical insight, seeing those benefits and not making a land grab for that data per se, making it very clear that other people have rights to exploit and use and repurpose the data is the important thing here.
Okay, thank you.
And the issue about resources, I'd love it if under those kind of great kind of results that Google to think that it could actually put some more resources into this kind of thing because it's our national infrastructure and your national infrastructure.
3,000 more employees.
Excellent. I look forward to some of them working on open data. That would be fabulous. Yeah.
Question here. Got one at the back.
Tony Gillespie, a fellow of the Academy. There are concerns in the artificial intelligence community about inherent biases in data and how you use it. Not the obvious ones, Holland, the one of the population where they ignored the flooded area, but for instance, the disqualified officers you mentioned from Companies House. That might, if you took that as absolute truth, would it also include court cases for bankruptcy or for other things that don't automatically go into Companies House? Is that sort of issue being addressed?
I think it's certainly increasingly high on the agenda, which is, as you say, to be very. What is the methodology? So we come in possession of these remarkable new capabilities, and I think that's part of the challenge. Moore's law is partly to blame here. Organizations are in possession of power that often runs ahead of their ability to even know what it means necessarily to be appropriately controlled and regulated. They have a capability, and in many contexts, it's a capability that we might recognize as being useful. But the methodology of of sampling, of understanding how machine learning at scale is going to work, how it's going to justify itself, how it can be presented, whether the originating data already contains bias, and to understand what its nature is. That's part of the scientific and engineering process that we're all learning to understand further. And of course, there are areas of active research on this. But the kind of pressure to push it into kind of deployment is very great. And I think that it's really rather important that we consider just what the initial conditions are, what the assumptions behind these approaches are, and it's an issue for open data. We sit in our open data work alongside organisations like the Office for National Statistics, who have a statutory obligation to produce well-organised, well-managed, well-sampled information. Of course, much of that is openly available now, but it's understanding the methodology of effective use of data, literacy and education, again, as much as just rushing to press the button on the new algorithm.
Thank you. So a question at the back.
I'm Barbara Walker from IORMA. My organisation focuses on the impact on individuals of the way that society and technology are moving forward. I'd rather like to go back to the public-private sector thing because, Sir Nigel, I've really enjoyed your description of the wins on access to public sector data, and also on the keen need for better ways to integrate data sets in the from the public sector. But just going back to the private sector, there are huge data sets also held by producers and retailers of consumer goods, provision of other consumer services such as travel. There are the utilities. Would you not? You did say that sometimes you felt that we should have a go at some of these organisations. Would you not like to say more about that? My second question is, on the same subject, is there always a clear distinction between the rules applying to the public and private sectors? Where would you place the utilities, for example? And where, if we go a little bit further towards the private sector, do you see any prospect of opening up of data from sector associations and professional bodies?
Well, I mean, just to take that point first, the kind of move to public-private partnerships, the move to outsourcing of many public services into the private sector. The challenge there, I think, is at the point of procurement. I think it should, in many cases, be part of the procurement process. And in fact, people have worked quite hard on some of this, but there's always more to do. And it's about reminding people that this is a principle it's worth adopting at the point of procurement, to insist that the data doesn't go with the contract necessarily. And what happened with the rail operators was that when they were privatized, the data went because the contracts were not drawn to keep that data available for wider public reuse. So I think that particular issue is one that we could address through really diligent scrutiny, and this is something that PASC and other parliamentary committees have thought about and written on. The private argument, I mean, there are many companies who are beginning to see the opportunity, and have traditionally seen the opportunity, in making certain of their data sets openly available. A conversation we have at the Open Data Institute very often with corporates is to explore their information assets in a much more innovative way, and to think about what the benefit could be, rather than sitting there thinking this is probably an asset we might be able to sweat, but we haven't thought how to do it yet, to take a very different view, to say the network effect of this information being available could be huge. Thomson Reuters, with whom we work, had a set of financial products and services which they had got a register for that they used to essentially sell. They now make that information openly available. And that has been a huge boom. What they've recognized, of course, is the fact that they have authoritative provenance on these identifiers for these products drives the market to use those identifiers. And of course, they associate lots of enriching information with those. So it's an interesting way in which, by becoming a data authority as a private organization in an area, by opening up much more data, you actually become a very effective part of the data ecosystem and widen your market and services.
Okay, thank Thank you. A question here? I'll come to you.
My name is Jeff Lomer. You haven't said very much, and I'd like your comment on receiving the data, analysing it, and deciding whether it's relevant to your business. And what I have in mind is postulate a small startup company. At the moment, they can access certain things. They will now be able to get a plethora of things, all of which there's a lot of work involved in deciding whether it's relevant or applicable to their business. And could you see that that's a problem in that they might have an enormous workload of trying to analyse the data which will now be available to them?
So is this data generated by the company itself or data it's looking to exploit from open data sources? Sorry.
No, I think accessing data from the open source, that they can now
I
get almost unlimited things, and they could sit there thinking of unlimited things to look at, and in the end perhaps don't do anything.
I think there was a little bit of that sense when bulk data sets were simply being released to people and people thought, well, what do we choose? How do we make an intelligent decision? I think the API approach has been quite an interesting development, because this is typically data that is engineered to a certain quality level, and if you're building a business based on access to this service and either the service goes away or it's serving poor data, you get to hear about it. In fact, the API is almost a threshold test around whether the data has value. But your point about what do you pay attention to? Again, one of the things we're seeing emerging is almost this idea that we see in social programming of social data use. There are clear hierarchies that emerge over data sets which have large uptake and high utility. And I think we need to kind of foster the communities to understand where the value is. It is a long tail. I mean, there are data sets, really very arcane ones, that are relevant to some particular businesses that would be hardly used or noticed by other people. But I think that's, again, an issue where we need to do rather more about reminding people of what the assets are and what the tests they can apply. So being a discriminating user of data is increasingly important. In an age of the Internet of Things, where increasingly more information is flooding into the system, you really do want to ask those questions. And I think a need for standards around that is also pretty important. And not least, as we've seen recently, the security implications of that as well.
Mm-hmm. There was a question here.
Yes, Simon Watts. Did you spoke a bit about exploiting the knowledge of the crowd, and I wondered, and governments learning from this, is it possible to exploit the knowledge of the crowd without having to employ thousands of people to filter the data?
Again, we find that in particular areas, the call to action that you can get from crowds is very powerful indeed. It's particularly impressive in areas like civilian response. So we see this in flooding. Actually, very, very interestingly, we've seen this internationally in areas like humanitarian relief. There's a very interesting hub, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is sharing data on particular events in Syria, Nepal, all sorts of areas that are facing real challenges, environmental and man-made. And there, a large part of that is invoking the crowd, motivated individuals to either acquire the data in the first place, so the sensors we all carry about with us now that can be used, or indeed to filter and improve and enhance it. So when the Nepalese earthquake struck, 4,000 volunteers in 48 hours using OpenStreetMap, satellite data, whole range of other algorithms and data, produced damage assessment reports for a ruined capital, and a very extraordinary product it was. So I think there are contexts where people can be motivated. There is more mundane outsourcing, I think, that we could think about doing. In a sense, crowdsourcing is understood as a form of legitimately getting work done. I'm not sure that we have thought quite enough about whether we couldn't put the crowd. It happens spontaneously with our bus stops. Perhaps we could think about engineering for it.
Question there?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Kieran Geenamar. We touched on this.
Could you hold the microphone?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. We touched on this earlier, I think, about making the spectrum of data, the part of that which is open, wider. And I think again with the healthcare data from Google, where they had to anonymize the data before they shared it. Is there a what do you think is the best way of opening up sort of some of the more sensitive data to researchers and to the general population without infringing on sort of...
I mean, there is a lot of work going on in this, and indeed there are well understood and managed resources. We have a whole set of things in universities and various other agencies, the administrative data centers, where certain classes of data are hugely sensitive, literally don't leave the site physically. You have to go in to the terminals to access it. There are areas where the use of essentially staging of data into use in clinical trials, the Farr Institute in Edinburgh doing some very interesting work on using permissioning between data sets to link them from various parts of the population who are in need of social and health care. Different approaches. And then there, of course, is the notion of anonymization. And people say, well, any anonymization method you can give me, I can probably spend enough time and resource, I can perhaps de-anonymize. And that is a bit of an arms race. But there are other things you can do. And again, in medical research, the act of de-anonymization is purpose limited. De-anonymization is an offense. We don't often go after it, or we haven't actually in many cases used that remedy or redress. If we want to be serious about it, we should make that very clear. The international context, then people say, well, this data could end up anywhere and could be being dereferenced. It's increasingly hard not to think that we need to develop new norms of regulation, new norms of international behavior around some of this. Of course, the dark web will always be there, but our actual use as institutions and organizations of data needs probably some thought as well. And when you saw the kind of security concerns around denial of service attacks and start to get a sense of what we've got to do internationally to just wake up to the fact that this isn't in anybody's interest when one is attacking each other's national infrastructure. Better norms of behavior. Again, establishing how we might manage that, fairly important.
Can you say a little bit more about security, both at an individual and corporate and national level? I mean, bits of information separately might be not contain much information at all, but join it up together, you can get a very complete pattern of people's behaviour or all sorts of things which open all sorts of risks. Same at corporate level. How should that be handled? And I think standards aren't really enough. It needs more.
No,
how do you police that kind
Certainly
of
there are
behaviour?
methods and techniques that can kind of act as at least disincentives, you could argue, that you're actually making the job more explicitly difficult. And so there's I think a range of activities from decently well-managed anonymization, and there's a UK anonymization network which will provide advice on just this. The Information Commissioner's Office, various forms of standard we can aspire to, but it's not enough in itself. And I think a large part of this will fall not to set technical solutions, but to social norms, to regulation, and in some cases the law. And it would seem to me that the expectation we have around what can and should be done needs to kind of start to kind of reflect the fact that we're not going to give up on privacy. So this idea that somehow the surveillance states means that what we're collecting and routinely on our mobile phones means that we're constantly tracked. The fact that people have information does not mean they can use it in other areas. We're well used to this to make particular sorts of decisions. So when we think about employment, we're quite aware of the fact that you may know your age and ethnic origin, but you're not allowed to make a decision based on that. And so the idea around information security is not just about obscuring and hiding it, it's about making people accountable for the way it's used. And I think that, again, brings us back to issues around algorithmic accountability. In the era of big data, being very clear about how decisions are being made, or whether we're comfortable for decisions to be made of certain sorts on the basis of data, or just because they can, should they, is the debate we need to have.
And is that debate keeping pace with the rate at which the linkages between data is developing?
So Moore's law, they always say if you want to get ahead, you need to find a kind of a log law and get it named after you. So maybe there's a network effect around data I have to be after on this. I think it's not. It's always a challenge. And I think those exponents of change means that, again, the capability is an offer before a lot of the regulatory and social norming has come into play. And the question is this inevitable? Will it always take a moral panic to suddenly get an agency to work differently or think differently? And would it be better in some cases to think ahead of the event so that you give people permission to be innovative and not chill the whole system down? I think that data and privacy and algorithmic accountability, these things we've been talking about tonight, are the kinds of things that warrant really big thinking at the level of at the level of states and organizations. And regulations, we have the general directive on data regulation, the European one. There are these things around, but sometimes people worry that they're almost too blunt an instrument, that we have to get a much more effective balance between merits and benefits, disbenefits, demerits.
Well, Nigel, thank you very much. You've given us a really interesting talk. And we've had a wide cross-section of questions and discussions with you. And thank you very much for a very entertaining, stimulating session.
Thank you. Thank you.